There are times when we feel like we are simply floating through life, as if everything is happening around us, but never really happening to us. Have you ever found yourself thinking, why do I always seem to return to the same point? Why do my attempts to change seem to fail? Why, despite all my effort, do I still feel stuck in patterns that I can't break? Life seems like a repetitive cycle, and there is something inside of us that insists on keeping us stuck. This cycle is often not just a reflection of our conscious choices, but an invisible force, an energy that operates in the shadows of our psyche. It's not easy to notice, but it's there, acting on us, manipulating us, making us go in circles. The dark law. It is not an external entity, it is not a destiny that simply happens to us, but an internal force that lives within us, guiding our actions and decisions. And scariest of all, we often have no idea she's in charge. Let's imagine for a moment the story of a man who is constantly in search of approval. From a young age, he learned that the only way to be seen and accepted was to please others. He was taught, without realizing it, that his needs, his desires, and his authenticity were secondary to the need to please. Years have passed, and this man, now an adult, feels growing frustration. He achieved the goals he thought were most important: a good career, a successful relationship, friends around him. But despite this, he feels empty. At each of these milestones, he doesn't feel genuine joy, but just a confirmation that once again he has managed to please. Something inside him screams, "This is not who I really am." He begins to realize that deep down, his choices have always been influenced by a deep fear, a need to be validated, to be accepted. He is trapped and doesn't know how to free himself. What he doesn't know is that his life is being governed by the dark law. This man, like all of us, has a part of himself that is hidden, that has been neglected, and that now needs to be integrated so that he can live authentically. He does not understand that, in trying to please, he has strayed from his true essence. The dark law, which he doesn't even realize, has total control over his life, manipulating his choices and keeping him trapped in a cycle of self-denial. But what, after all, is this dark law? How does it manifest itself in our lives? It is not an abstract theory or something distant from our everyday reality. The dark law is in each of us, in the limiting beliefs that have been imposed on us, in the unhealed wounds that continue to bleed in our psyche, in the unconscious fears that paralyze us. It presents itself as a defense mechanism which seeks to preserve our identity, but at the same time prevents us from evolving. The fear of failure, the fear of being rejected, the fear of not being what others expect of us, these are all expressions of this invisible force. Imagine that the dark law acts like a constant shadow, something that you carry, but that for a long time you try to ignore. It disguises itself as normal, acceptable, or necessary behaviors, such as the incessant search for perfection, recognition, or approval. It makes us believe that we need to achieve certain external goals to be happy, to be complete. And so we spend our entire lives chasing an ideal that in the end always leaves us dissatisfied, because it is never enough. What we lack is not what is outside of us, but what is inside, the true connection with our essence. The dark law also manifests itself in the choices we make without actually choosing. Often, the decisions we make are not the result of conscious reflection or genuine will. They come from a deep place of insecurity, of lack. It's as if a part of us is always trying to compensate for the lack of something, trying to fill an internal void with external expectations. A practical example of this can be seen in many people who, despite achieving great achievements at work, never feel fulfilled. They are successful, but they do not feel satisfaction because, in fact, they are seeking something that will never be fulfilled by external achievements alone. This emptiness is the reflection of a disconnection with one's own being, and it is the dark law that maintains this disconnection. There is also a facet of the dark law that manifests itself in the need for control. We, as human beings, seek security, and often think that to be happy, we need to have everything under control. What we don't realize is that often this search for control is an attempt to avoid suffering, to avoid confronting what we are afraid of. The fear of losing control is actually a reflection of a psyche that cannot deal with its own vulnerability. And when we try to control too much, we lose the true freedom to live. Control thus becomes an invisible prison, another manifestation of the dark law. All of this leads us to a disturbing reality. Without understanding the dark law, we are at the mercy of invisible forces that shape our lives, often without us being aware of it. And the most disconcerting thing is that until we face our own shadow, the part of us that has been left behind, neglected and unintegrated, we will remain prisoners of this cycle. But what if I told you that there was a way to break this cycle, to leave behind those invisible forces that control you? The secret to this begins with a simple understanding. The dark law does not need to be an enemy. It is, in fact, a key to transformation. And if you can look beyond appearances and recognize how it operates in your life, you can use it to your advantage. But for this to happen, you need to look inside, confront the fears that you have been ignoring, and above all, accept that no matter how challenging it may be, you have the power to change your reality. Now you might be wondering, how do you start doing this? How can we break out of this invisible prison and achieve true freedom? The answer is not simple, but it is liberating. It lies in something that perhaps you have forgotten or ignored: your ability to integrate everything that has been rejected within you. And that's what we're going to explore in the next steps. What comes next could be the key to the transformation you seek. If you still feel like you're stuck in an endless cycle, pay attention. The path to freedom begins now. The quest for individuation is, in many ways, one of the most profound journeys a human being can undertake. This journey is neither linear nor simple, and is often marked by moments of pain, questioning, and transformation. What many don't know is that this search begins in an almost invisible way, operating in the shadows of our psyche, long before we become aware of it. There is no clear map, there is no ready-made formula, but it is precisely this uncertain path that challenges us to become who we really are. What does it mean then to individuate? Individuation is the process of becoming a complete individual, of integrating the different parts of ourselves, those we accept and those we reject. And for that to happen, we need to face an uncomfortable truth. Most of us live most of our lives unconsciously, trapped in patterns we didn't create, but have been conditioned to follow. It's as if we are living a version of ourselves, but not the true one. And this version, which is stuck in fear, in external acceptance, in conformity, is a half-life version. She is not authentic. However, the process of individuation invites us to question all of this. He challenges us to delve into the deepest layers of our psyche, to confront what is hidden and, often, what has been rejected, what has been silenced. And we are not alone in this process. The collective unconscious, which is the basis of our psychological understanding, guides us, sharing with each of us images, symbols, and universal experiences that help us understand who we are and where we should go. This journey of individuation requires courage. Courage to look at the darkest aspects of ourselves. Imagine for a moment a woman who, throughout her life, sought to please others, always doing what was expected of her. From childhood, she was shaped by the opinions of others, and her identity was built around what she believed others expected of her. But when she reaches adulthood, something inside her starts to scream. She feels that despite everything she has built, there is an absence, a deep void. This emptiness is not caused by an external lack, but by a disconnection with your true essence. She begins to question, who am I really? Not the woman everyone thinks she is, not the one who lives to serve others, but the woman who inhabits her depths. The one she never had the courage to meet. This is the breaking point, the beginning of the individuation process. To become who she truly is, She will need to go beyond external expectations and explore aspects of herself that have been neglected, often repressed, and even feared. This means making room for your inner truth, even if it doesn't fit into norms or conventions. Individuation is, in essence, an integration of being. She challenges us to unite all parts of ourselves: the good, the bad, the loved, the feared. The journey to individuation is, in large part, the journey to becoming whole, to becoming who we truly are. But this process is not easy. It demands a deep and unmasked look inside oneself, a process of and constant confrontation with the parts of ourselves we would rather ignore or reject. Individuation does not happen without pain. In many cases, it begins when we are faced with a crisis, a rupture that forces us to reevaluate our choices, our beliefs, and our path. It could be a loss, a disappointment, or even a growing sense of dissatisfaction that settles in our hearts. This is what, in many cases, drives us towards the individuation process, the pain of not being who we really are, the anguish of living in a distorted version of ourselves. In this moment of crisis, two options arise: continue living on autopilot in the shadows of what we were taught to be, or start asking the right questions and seek a new way of living. The path to individuation requires a willingness to delve into the shadows, that is, into the parts of ourselves that we don't like, that we deny, or that we don't know about. It takes courage to look at these aspects honestly and integrate them in a healthy way, without fear, without judgment. For example, consider a person who, throughout his life, has been taught to sacrifice himself for others. This behavior, although altruistic at first glance, can hide a lack of self-esteem and a fear of being rejected. This person's individuation therefore involves realizing that they have the right to take care of themselves, to put their own needs first, without feeling guilt. This does not mean selfishness, but a deep understanding that we can only give to others what we are capable of offering to ourselves. For this person, individuation will be a process of redefining the balance between giving and receiving, between caring for others and caring for oneself. Individuation, in other words, invites us to take a journey from ego to essence. The ego is that part of us that has been shaped by external experiences, social expectations, and often by the impositions of the world around us. The essence is our true nature, what is beyond the superficial, beyond the masks we wear. When we seek individuation, we are making an effort to deconstruct the ego and connect with our deepest essence. This process is long and often lonely. During individuation, we face internal dilemmas, moments of doubt, of discomfort. It is a journey that requires patience, resilience, and above all, honesty with yourself. But although difficult, the reward is indescribable. In the end, we are more complete, more whole, more true. So how can we begin this journey of individuation? How can we follow this path? The first step is recognition. We need to start noticing where we are living up to external expectations, where we are following a path that is not ours. We need to identify the areas of our lives where there is incongruity between what we do and what we feel. The next step involves courage. Courage to look at our weaknesses, our fears, and our shadows. We cannot become whole without confronting what is hidden within us, without making room for what we reject. And above all, we must have the courage to embrace our essence, even when it doesn't fit with what the world expects of us. Individuation is a journey of no return. Once we take the first step, there is no going back. We can no longer live superficially or in the shadows of who we have been conditioned to be. True freedom, however, lies exactly there, in accepting who we are, in integrating all parts of ourselves. And what comes next? The next step is to discover how these parts that we are integrating connect with the collective unconscious, with the greater forces that guide us. Individuation, after all, is not a solitary journey. It is fed by the energies that come from all of us, from those who walk alongside us, and also from the collective wisdom that is transmitted to us. But how does this happen? This is what we will explore in the next step. The collective unconscious is a deep and mysterious concept, something that transcends individual experiences and connects to something much larger than ourselves. When we talk about the collective unconscious, we are referring to a reservoir of universal memories, experiences, images, and symbols that are shared by all humanity. This is a level of the human psyche that does not belong to a specific individual, but rather to the human species as a whole, as a field that contains the collective experiences and archetypes that shape our lives, our beliefs, and our attitudes. But how does the collective unconscious manifest itself in our daily lives? How can we access this deep and invisible dimension of the human psyche? The answer to these questions begins to take shape when we realize that, although many of our actions and thoughts seem to be exclusively personal and individual, in reality we are deeply influenced by greater forces. These archetypes, which inhabit the collective unconscious, have the power to shape us without us realizing it, and they are the ones who often guide the decisions we make, the paths we choose, and even the relationships we establish. Let's imagine, for example, a person who has a strong tendency to act as a savior, someone who feels a constant impulse to help others, often at the expense of their own happiness or well-being. If this person explores the origin of this need to save, they may discover that it is not something purely personal or a simple characteristic of their personality. Instead, it may be a manifestation of a deeper archetype, the hero or savior, which inhabits the collective unconscious and which is often projected by myths, stories, and cultural traditions that span generations. This archetype, with its strengths and weaknesses, is transmitted across cultures and manifests itself universally, regardless of individual origin or context. These archetypes are not just abstract symbols or philosophical concepts. They have a real impact on our lives. We often make decisions based on the desire to fulfill a role determined by these archetypes without even realizing that we are just repeating patterns that have been shaped by past generations. The idea of being a hero, for example, is embedded in the cultural narrative of almost all human civilizations and can be a force that drives both our behavior and our fears and insecurities. The collective unconscious, by connecting us with these universal patterns, exerts a silent but profound power over our psyche. But how do we access this collective unconscious? How can we delve into these deep layers of the psyche and discover which archetypes are influencing us? The answer lies in the process of self-knowledge. The collective unconscious is not something that can be unlocked with a simple act of will. It reveals itself through life experiences, through moments of deep reflection, introspection, and often when confronted with situations that activate these archetypes in our behavior. For example, imagine that someone who has spent their entire life feeling insignificant, inferior, or incapable suddenly begins to experience leadership or excel in some aspect of life. This may be a manifestation of the hero archetype who is struggling to emerge from the shadow and take his place in the world. The collective unconscious in this case is pushing this person forward into a greater role, and at the same time it is bringing to the surface all the insecurities and fears that the person needs to overcome to become the leader they were designed to be. Archetypes are like maps of the collective unconscious that guide us throughout life. Each of us carries within us a multitude of these archetypes, and they all have a role to play in our personal development. But it's not enough to just recognize them. It is necessary to integrate them in a healthy way. In other words, the simple act of becoming aware that we are being guided by these archetypes is not enough. We need to learn to work with them, to understand their lessons, and to use their energies in a balanced way. However, the collective unconscious is not just a collection of archetypes. It is also a field of ancestral wisdom. The images and symbols we find in it were not just created by ancient cultures, they also represent the collective experiences of humanity over millennia. These symbols, which appear in dreams, myths, and even our deepest intuitions, are like keys to internal doors that connect us to a deeper knowledge about ourselves and the world. When we can access these symbols, we can also access the universal truths that form the basis of all human experience. And how can we access these symbols? The key is to practice introspection and be willing to listen to the messages that come from within. The collective unconscious communicates with us in different ways, through dreams, art, literature, mythologies, and even our own feelings and emotions. Often these messages come disguised in symbolic forms that at first glance appear simple or trivial. But if we are attentive, we can begin to decipher these messages and understand how the archetypes and symbols are manifesting in our lives. A classic example of how these symbols appear in our lives can be found in Jungian psychology, which is one of the main schools of thought on the collective unconscious. Carl Jung, the psychologist who popularized the concept of the collective unconscious, believed that symbols and archetypes are gateways to deep knowledge that connects us to our true nature. When analyzing our dreams, Jung identified repetitive patterns of symbols, such as the wise old man, the great mother, the hero, the shadow, symbols that are not just personal, but collective, shared by all beings, humans regardless of their culture or history. However, accessing the collective unconscious is not an automatic process. We must be willing to open the doors of our inner being, to listen to the messages that arise in our mind and in our feelings, to reflect on the deep meaning of the experiences we live. As we move along this path, we can begin to realize that the stories we tell about ourselves are not just our own, but a part of a larger tale, one that is being woven across all human generations. These stories connect us to ancestral wisdom and a universal truth that transcends the individual. However, it is necessary to keep in mind that the collective unconscious also has a dark side. The influence of these archetypes is not always beneficial. The collective unconscious does not distinguish between what is healthy and what is destructive. It only transmits the patterns, images, and energies that are present in the human psyche. Therefore, when connecting with the collective unconscious, we need to be prepared to deal with the shadow of these archetypes, with the aspects of ourselves that we don't want to see, that scare us, or that we try to avoid. The journey, therefore, is twofold. At the same time as we connect with the collective unconscious and become more aware of the archetypes and symbols that guide us, we also need to confront the shadow that each of these archetypes brings with it. This is the true challenge of individuation, integrating both positive and destructive forces, lights and shadows, in a balanced way. As we progress along this journey, we begin to realize that individuation is not just a personal path, but also a collective process. We are all connected by these universal forces, and each of us's journey is actually a reflection of humanity's journey as a whole. This is the power of the collective unconscious. It reminds us that despite our differences, we are all connected by something much bigger than ourselves. And what comes next? What happens when we begin to understand the importance of archetypes and the collective unconscious in our lives? The answer to this question takes us directly to the next stage, understanding how these archetypes and symbols manifest in our practical lives and how we can use them for our transformation. How then can we use this collective wisdom to integrate the shadow aspects and to move forward on the journey of individuation? We will explore this soon. Archetypes are universal images and symbols that span time and space, shaping our lives in subtle but powerful ways. They are like lenses through which we perceive the world, influencing not only our emotions and behaviors, but also the stories we tell, the choices we make, and the roles we assume. When we talk about archetypes, we are referring to primordial models that are rooted in the collective unconscious, that which is common to all humanity. These images do not arise from a specific personal experience, but from a universal psychological inheritance which crosses generations and cultures. The concept of archetypes was deepened by Carl Jung, who believed that they are expressions of the human psyche, fundamental archetypes that manifest themselves in our lives in different ways. According to Jung, archetypes are not just literary or mythological figures, but psychological structures that influence how we perceive the world and how we react to it. They are timeless patterns that carry deep meanings, capable of changing our emotions and our destinies. Classic examples include the hero, the great mother, the sage, the trickster, and the shadow. These archetypes are not just abstract ideas or cultural representations. They manifest themselves in everyday life, in the situations we live in the stories we tell, in the films we watch, in the books we read, in the religions we practice, and even in the dreams we have. They emerge in moments of crisis, in transitional phases of life such as birth, death, marriage, separation, and other significant events. They are also present when we are faced with difficult choices or existential questions that challenge us to question our identity and our place in the world. For example, the hero archetype can manifest itself in someone who, faced with great difficulty or adversity, feels the need to fight, to overcome obstacles, to achieve something significant, whether for themselves or for others. This hero figure is found in many mythologies around the world, from Hercules, the mythological figure of ancient Greece, to characters like Harry Potter or Frodo Baggins, who are called to a journey of self-knowledge and transformation. The hero faces challenges, finds allies and enemies, and ultimately returns transformed, wiser and stronger. But the hero archetype does not only manifest itself in great deeds or epic adventures. He is present in our everyday lives. Every time we face a challenge, whether at work, in the family, or within ourselves, there is a moment when we are called to take courageous action, to face a fear, to overcome an internal or external limitation. The manifestation of the hero archetype, therefore, does not depend on the grandeur of the action, but rather on the courage to make a transformative decision. Another powerful archetype is that of the Great Mother, which represents not only motherhood, but also the idea of nutrition, protection, creation, and acceptance. This archetype can manifest itself in different forms, in the biological mother, in the figure of a woman who takes care of others, but it can also be symbolic, representing nature, the earth, the ancestral wisdom that nourishes and cares. It is linked to the desire to care, to protect, to create, but it can also be associated with overprotection or excessive attachment, which can become a burden. On the other hand, the shadow archetype is a powerful and often misunderstood force. It is made up of repressed or denied aspects of the human psyche, those traits, feelings, and impulses that we do not accept in ourselves and that therefore remain in the unconscious. The shadow is, in a way, the hidden side of our personality, that which we reject or ignore, but which continues to exert a powerful influence on our lives, often in a negative way. The shadow relationship can manifest as repressed anger, envy, fear, or resentment, and when these aspects are not recognized and integrated, they can manifest in destructive ways. Integrating the shadow, therefore, is a fundamental process for personal growth. It's looking inward and accepting the parts of ourselves that we would otherwise try to hide or deny. But shadow integration is not easy. It requires courage to face the darkest parts of our psyche, and often this involves confronting our deepest fears. The shadow archetype is actually an opportunity, a chance to understand and integrate the hidden aspects of our personality to achieve greater authenticity and inner balance. The sage archetype is also a significant example. It represents the search for knowledge and wisdom, the deep understanding of life and human nature. The wise person is the one who, through life experiences and reflection, achieves a clear and profound vision of reality. This archetype is a figure that appears when we are looking for answers to the big questions of existence. It is the master who guides the hero on his journey, the inner voice that offers valuable advice in moments of doubt. In many traditions, the sage also represents the spiritual master who leads disciples on their quest for enlightenment. In a society increasingly focused on immediacy and superficiality, the archetype of the wise man invites us to slow down, reflect, and seek a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us. He challenges us to step out of superficiality and connect with a deeper wisdom that transcends rational knowledge. To access this archetype, we often need moments of solitude and introspection, where we can listen to our inner voice and reflect on what really matters. These archetypes and their meanings are more than simple psychological concepts. They are the forces that drive us to evolve, transform, and understand ourselves better. Each archetype has a role to play in our journey of individuation, helping us overcome the internal and external obstacles that arise throughout life. However, at the same time, these archetypes bring with them challenges and shadows that must be faced if we are to achieve true transformation. As we become aware of these archetypes, we begin to realize that we are not just living our lives in isolation, but rather that we are participating in a larger story that is shared by all human beings. Each of us, in our own unique way, is playing a role in humanity's collective narrative, and to understand the archetypes is to understand the universal forces that connect us all. But what happens when we start to understand these archetypes in a deep and true way? How can we use them for our transformation and to achieve a fuller and more authentic life? The answer to this question leads us to the next part. How can we consciously integrate archetypes into our lives, and how, through this process, can we get closer to our true essence? Let's explore this in the next stage of our journey. The shadow is perhaps one of the deepest and most challenging concepts in Jungian psychology. It represents everything we deny, repress, or don't want to see in ourselves. These are the parts of our psyche that don't fit the image we want to project to the world, that often make us uncomfortable and that we avoid confronting. The shadow is closely linked to the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious, as a reflection of what is hidden or rejected by consciousness. However, shadow is not something simply negative or bad. In fact, it contains aspects that are fundamental to our personal transformation. The shadow is the reservoir of our repressed qualities, of unexplored desires, traits, and emotions that, if not integrated, can manifest in uncontrolled and harmful ways. When ignored, the shadow reveals itself in unexpected emotional outbursts, in destructive behavior patterns, or even in situations and relationships that repeat cycles of pain and frustration. Ignoring the shadow is, therefore, a way of sabotaging our own growth and evolution. This dark part of our psyche also contains undiscovered potentials. Often the qualities that we cannot accept in ourselves, whether anger, envy, fear, or even the desire for power, can be transformed into powerful forces if they are understood and used in a constructive way. For example, anger, when repressed and not expressed in a healthy way, can generate resentment that eventually explodes in disproportionate and destructive ways. However, when recognized and understood, anger can transform into motivation to act, to set limits, and to change what is no longer working in our lives. Contrary to what we often think, the shadow is not something to be banished or eliminated, but rather something to be integrated, accepted, and understood. True transformation begins when we can look at our shadow honestly and courageously. Carl Jung believed that shadow integration is essential to the process of individuation, the path to becoming who we truly are. This involves not only accepting the darker aspects of our psyche, but also embracing these parts as something that is part of our totality. Integrating the shadow is, in a way, a process of reconciliation with all the parts of ourselves that we have rejected or ignored. This is continuous and challenging work. It's not something that happens overnight, but rather a gradual and profound movement. To begin with, we need self-knowledge. We need to look inside and ask, what have I rejected in myself? What emotions am I afraid of feeling? What aspects of my personality or past would I prefer to forget? Often, the shadow manifests itself in subtle ways, in small gestures, in reactions that we don't fully understand, in things that bother us in others, in the projections we make. If we pay attention, we can begin to notice where our shadow is still active. One of the most effective means of integrating the shadow is self-dialogue, reflecting on our emotions and behaviors without judging or repressing them. Genuine acceptance of our shadow allows us to begin to reframe our experiences and understand the meaning behind our actions. This process can be profoundly liberating. Acceptance does not mean justifying or being complacent with negative behaviors, but rather recognizing that these parts of us have a reason to exist, and by understanding them, we can use them for our good and for the good of others. Furthermore, dreams are a powerful tool in the shadow integration process. Jung believed that dreams are a form of direct communication from the unconscious, a symbolic reflection of the parts of ourselves that are not integrated into consciousness. When we have vivid dreams, often featuring frightening or threatening figures, these characters often represent aspects of our shadow. Paying attention to these symbols and interpreting the meaning of our dreams can help us access these denied parts of our psyche and integrate them in a healthier way. Another important method of shadow integration is emotion work. Anger, sadness, envy, fear. All of these emotions are part of our human experience, and there is no need to be ashamed of them. What is necessary, however, is to learn to recognize these emotions when they arise, and to learn and dare to express them in a healthy way. Repressing these emotions generates tension, anxiety, and can lead us to self-destructive behaviors. Releasing these emotions in a safe and constructive way, whether through speaking, writing, art, or even meditation, is one of the most effective ways to integrate the shadow. But why is this so important? Because shadow integration is not just a psychological process, it profoundly affects our practical lives. When we can accept the repressed parts of our psyche, we become more authentic, more centered, more able to make decisions that are aligned with our true selves. And paradoxically, by accepting our weaknesses and imperfections, we also discover our hidden strengths and capabilities. The shadow, far from being something that weakens us, has the power to strengthen us in ways we would never imagine. There is an old story that illustrates this process well. In Greek mythology, there is the figure of Hades, the god of the underworld, who rules the kingdom of the dead. In many versions of mythology, Hades is portrayed as a feared figure, a personification of death and the unknown. However, he also has a vital role. He is the ruler of what is hidden, what has been buried, what is forgotten, but without him, life could not exist. Hades represents the need to confront and accept what we fear, what is on the margins of conscious life. Only by facing death, symbolized by Hades, can we find a new life, a new way of being. This metaphor can be applied to our internal journey with the shadow. Only by accepting and confronting what we fear or reject in ourselves can we achieve a new freedom, a freedom that allows us to live more fully, more truly, more aligned with our essence. Ignoring the shadow is living half a life, living a fragmented and often wasted life. Integrating it, on the other hand, is embracing the totality of who we are with all our contradictions, and this allows us to achieve a deep integration with the world around us. Now, it is important to ask, how can we free ourselves from the shackles of an unintegrated life? How can we truly look at our shadow and make peace with it? The next part of this journey will help us understand the first steps of this radical transformation. What comes next is a path that, although challenging, takes us to a state of authenticity and true freedom. The ego is the structure of our conscious identity. It is like the mask we use to present ourselves to the world, what defines us as individuals and allows us to navigate reality in a functional way. It is formed by our experiences, our beliefs, our values, and to a large extent by the way we want to be seen by others. The ego is the part of the psyche that gives us the feeling of being someone, of having a name, a story, and a position in the world. But paradoxically, the ego, although essential for our adaptation to everyday life, can also be a prison. At its core, the ego is a construct. It is not our totality, but a representation of who we believe we are. It serves to maintain our survival in the material world, to ensure that we can function in social relationships, and to help us interact effectively with external reality. However, as we seek a sense of identity, the ego can begin to constrain us, limit us, distance us from our true nature. This happens because we often identify so much with the ego that we start to believe that we are just that, what the ego says we are. And this is a big mistake, an illusion. The ego is transitory, it is changeable, and is subject to changes and crises throughout life. The ego you have at 20, for example, is very different from the ego you will have at 50. And when external conditions change, when we go through losses, failures, or inner transformations, the ego can go into crisis, questioning its own self, identity, generating anguish and insecurity. A classic example of this is the identity crisis that many people face after a major failure or significant loss, such as the loss of a job, a relationship, or even a comfortable living situation. The ego, which was based on an image of success or status, finds itself undone, and the individual feels lost, not knowing who they are, not knowing what their purpose is. The ego, when based on a rigid and static identity, becomes vulnerable to any external event that challenges that identity, and this fragility can be devastating, leading to depression, anxiety, and a feeling of disorientation. Furthermore, the ego also expresses itself through the need for control. The incessant search to control the world, situations, and even others is an attempt to maintain the security of the constructed identity. But, just as like a house built on sand, this control is illusory and unstable. Life is unpredictable, and no matter how much the ego tries to control every aspect of our existence, it always comes up against limits that it cannot overcome. The attempt to control the uncontrollable generates suffering, as it is a constant struggle against the nature of life. The ego, then, is not necessarily an evil entity in itself. It has its function, its reason for existing, but it needs to be understood and often transcended. The problem arises when we identify too much with the ego, when it becomes the center of our being. When this happens, life becomes a constant search for external validation, recognition, and affirmation of the self. The ego always seeks confirmation of its existence, whether through material goods, social status, achievements, or even validation on social networks. But this search is insatiable because the ego is never satisfied. He always wants more, always needs more, and this creates a deep emptiness. Ultimately, the ego prevents us from accessing our true essence, which is deeper, broader, and richer than any constructed identity. In contrast to this incessant and often selfish search, the journey of individuation, proposed by Carl Jung, teaches us to look beyond the ego. Individuation does not mean denying the ego, but rather integrating it within a larger context. It means recognizing the ego as a necessary part of our psyche, but understanding that it is not all that we are. The true I goes beyond the ego. It encompasses our shadows, our emotions, and even the archetypes that inhabit the collective unconscious. A healthy ego, then, is one that does not cling to its limited identity, that does not define itself by what it has or by the opinions of others. He is flexible, open to change, and aware of his own impermanence. A healthy ego is one that has the courage to question itself, to evolve and transform itself. To develop a healthy ego, we need to begin to understand our deepest motivations, those impulses that lead us to act in a certain way. We often act impulsively without reflecting on the reasons behind our choices. The ego, in its most selfish form, is driven by the desire for power, control, and approval. However, when we begin to observe these motivations more clearly, we can make decisions that are more aligned with our true nature rather than giving in to external pressures or social expectations. Self-knowledge is the key to this process. Meditation, deep reflection, self-talk, and therapy are powerful tools to discover what really motivates us, to understand where our desire for control or our need for validation comes from. By asking ourselves who we really are, we can begin to detach our identity from our ego and connect with a deeper dimension of our being. Furthermore, we need to learn to practice humility. Humility does not mean diminishing or belittling ourselves, but rather recognizing that we are part of something bigger, that we do not own the whole truth, and that there is always room for growth and learning. Humility allows us to deconstruct the rigid ego and make room for true transformation. When we practice humility, we stop living according to the ego and start living according to something more authentic, more true, and more connected with the whole. Finally, it is important to remember that the ego does not disappear. It is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a part of us that, if well understood, can be an important ally on the journey of individuation. A healthy ego is one that does not cling to the image it projects to the world, but is capable of navigating life with awareness, flexibility, and authenticity. The ego does not need to be the source of our suffering. It can be the key to a more integrated, more balanced, and truer life. Now that we understand the importance of a balanced and healthy ego, we can begin to look at how to integrate our shadow and expand our consciousness beyond our limited identity. But how can we avoid the dangers of the spiritual ego? How can we transcend the illusion that the search for an enlightened ego is, in fact, a form of disguised selfishness? We will explore this in the next part, a crucial step in understanding how spirituality, when misdirected, can reinforce ego traps. Shadow integration is one of the most powerful and transformative processes we can experience on our inner journey. The shadow is made up of all the aspects of our psyche that we reject or ignore, often because they are seen as negative or undesirable. These are those feelings, behaviors, and thoughts that we cannot accept as part of who we are, whether due to shame, fear, or nonconformity. Instead of facing them, we project these aspects onto other people or situations. We distort our perception of reality, creating a separation between what we consider good and bad, between what we want to show the world and what we try to hide. The shadow is not something that just appears in moments of weakness or adversity. It is always present within us, waiting to be recognized and integrated. The question is not whether it exists, but whether we are willing to accept it and work with it. Carl Jung, who was mainly responsible for popularizing the concept of shadow, emphasized that the shadow is essential for our psychological growth. By ignoring or denying it, we not only create internal conflicts, but we also limit our ability to live an authentic life. We cannot achieve our totality or individuation without first facing the shadow head-on. Imagine for a moment a mirror that reflects not only your outer image, but also everything you hide from yourself. The weaknesses, the fears, the repressed anger, the insecurities, the forbidden desires, the painful memories. The shadow is this distorted reflection of our psyche, and integrating it is the process of facing these parts with courage, of accepting them without judgment. In doing so, we transform what was once a hidden burden into a source of creative, transformative energy. The shadow integration process begins with awareness. The first step is simply recognizing that it exists. This can come as a shock because we are used to seeing ourselves in an idealized way, as if we were rational, controlled, and pure beings. The reality, however, is much more complex and nuanced. We all carry aspects within us that are not so pleasant, and it takes humility to accept that, on some level, we are all flawed, imperfect. When we can see our shadow without condemnation, without seeing ourselves as bad people for having these aspects, we begin to take the first step towards integration. For example, if you find yourself constantly irritated with others, feeling angry about situations you cannot control, it may be a reflection of an aspect of your shadow that involves the fear of being powerless or the frustration of not being heard. Anger, then, is not just a defect, but a sign of something deeper, a desire for control, validation, or power that needs to be understood and integrated. Anger is not just negative. It can become a powerful force for self-knowledge if we know how to direct it towards something constructive. Furthermore, the shadow can manifest itself in repetitive patterns in our lives. Dysfunctional relationships, bad choices, self-sabotaging behaviors, all of these situations can be reflections of unresolved aspects of the shadow. For example, someone who constantly finds themselves in abusive relationships may be projecting a part of themselves that is not accepted, such as the need to be controlled or the unconscious belief that they do not deserve better. Recognizing these patterns is not easy, but it is a crucial step to get out of repetition and start walking a more conscious path. Integrating the shadow also requires the ability to forgive ourselves. This is because often the shadow is made up of parts of us that we are ashamed of or that we feel we shouldn't have. If you're afraid of feeling envious or jealous, for example, it can be difficult to accept these feelings as part of who you are. However, by recognizing that we all at some point experience these feelings, you begin to give permission for these emotions to exist without being consumed by them. The secret is not to be dominated by these aspects, but to recognize them, understand them, and eventually transform them into something constructive. It's not about getting rid of the shadow, but about integrating it into our being, so that it no longer has the power to control us unconsciously. One of the most effective ways to integrate the shadow is through introspection, meditation, and therapy. Introspection allows you to observe your own thoughts and emotions without judging them, creating a healthy distance between you and the aspects of your psyche that you want to avoid. Meditation, in turn, helps cultivate acceptance and self-knowledge, allowing you to connect with the deepest part of yourself, the one that is not shaped by social masks or superficial desires. Therapy, especially Jungian psychotherapy, is a powerful tool for working with the shadow, as it helps to bring to the surface unconscious content that may be blocked and, at the same time, offers a safe space to deal with this content in a constructive way. Shadow can also be integrated creatively. Artists, musicians, writers, and other creators often access their dark aspects in productive ways. By transforming repressed emotions or painful experiences into art, they can release this energy in a healthy and expressive way. The act of creating can be a powerful way of dealing with parts of the shadow that we normally wouldn't be able to express in any other way. This does not mean that everyone needs to become an artist, but rather that we should look for healthy ways to express what is stored within us. When we can integrate the shadow, it stops being a source of suffering or fear. It becomes an ally, a force that drives us towards authenticity and growth. We can look at what we once denied with a new perspective, and instead of feeling trapped by our own inner demons, we begin to use them to strengthen us. The shadow, when integrated, helps us understand the complexities of life and accept that we are multifaceted beings, that we do not need to be perfect to be complete. True transformation happens when we stop running from the shadow and start embracing it, When we understand that the parts of us we fear most can become sources of wisdom, self-knowledge, and power, and this is the path to a full life, where the ego and the shadow coexist harmoniously, each fulfilling its role in our journey of individuation. Now that you have begun to understand the shadow integration process, another question arises: how to prevent the spiritual ego from becoming a new form of prison? How can we not fall into the trap of an ego that dresses up as spirituality to continue seeking validation and control? We will explore this topic in the next step of our journey. The spiritual ego is one of the most insidious and difficult to identify facets in the process of self-knowledge. It disguises itself as virtue, camouflages itself under the highest practices and purest intentions, such as the search for enlightenment, connection with the divine, or the performance of good deeds. However, no matter how well-intentioned it may be, the spiritual ego carries with it a separation mechanism, making the practitioner feel superior to others, or even worse, trapped in an idea of perfect spirituality that never materializes. This ego, in its most subtle state, feeds on the idea that we are more advanced than others, more connected, or more enlightened. This can appear almost imperceptibly, often in small judgments, in the criticism we make to those who do not share our vision, or even in the desire for our spiritual practices to be recognized or valued. Instead of getting closer to the essence of spirituality, which is unity and humility, the spiritual ego reinforces the idea of separation and superiority. This type of ego also manifests itself in the incessant search for a state of perfection or awakening. Instead of surrendering to the present and the process of continuous transformation, we seek to achieve a goal, a transcendent experience that makes us feel better or different from others. This feeds a vicious cycle where true spirituality, which is the acceptance of the present moment and the integration of our shadows, is lost in the attempt to win a prize that never arrives. Furthermore, the spiritual ego expresses itself when we believe that there is only one truth or path. It arises when, instead of respecting and welcoming different forms of spirituality, we start to judge other people's beliefs, believing that our vision is the only true or superior one. This behavior not only distances us from others, but also prevents us from living the true essence of spirituality, acceptance of differences, and connection with the whole. To avoid falling into the traps of the spiritual ego, the key is to practice humility and constant self-examination. True spirituality does not seek to stand out, but to integrate. It's not about being recognized, but about being true to yourself and others. By freeing ourselves from the need for external validation, we can begin to live in a more authentic and genuine way, where the ego does not appear as an obstacle, but as a part of the growth process. True spiritual transformation happens when we accept our imperfections and failures, and not when we seek to be more spiritual than others. It lies in the ability to live our truth without the need to be recognized or validated. The spiritual ego, with its subtle disguises, can only be overcome through constant awareness and the practice of acceptance. Now that we understand the dangers of the spiritual ego, the question that arises is, how can we apply this wisdom in our everyday lives? How can we live in a more integrated and authentic way without falling into the traps of illusion? This is precisely what we will explore in the next step, when we will address practices and insights that can help us live more genuinely and fully on our spiritual journey.